From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where we persist in our firm belief that curling is not a sport, it's just a thing that happened because Canada didn't have enough bowling alleys. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the Blast Radio. So good to have you with us tonight. You know what time it is now? It's that time, once again, when we dispose of yet another category error that tends to fatally poison the quality of the public discourse on an issue of fairly great significance. This particular category error is one that seems to know no particular political dividing lines. It's a misunderstanding that afflicts the vast majority of Anglophone Americans, and it's a uniquely stupid misunderstanding. So tonight, we shall confront it as we always confront things, as only we can, by taking a pleasant, leisurely stroll through the verdant, gently rolling meadow of objective reality, pausing occasionally to take a drink from the stream of historical perspective that runs through it, and carefully avoiding the piles of intellectual dog crap that have caused such regrettably large numbers of us to engage in the foolish, ignorant modes of thought that make monologues like this necessary in the first place. And so tonight, ladies and gentlemen, in the enduring and abiding interest of the public mental hygiene, we present herewith, for your kind consideration, Curmudgeon's Field Guide to White Latinos. Prologue, The Beige Illusion. There is a decidedly peculiar belief that has taken root in the American imagination, a belief so durable and so often unexamined that it now floats through polite conversation like so much scented air freshener. And it goes a little something like this. If a person speaks Spanish and hails from south of the Rio Grande, they must, by definition, be brown. Not might be, not often are, but must be. As though somewhere between Laredo and Lima there exists a giant ultraviolet lamp that gently toasts all European ancestry into a uniform shade of something we might call civic diversity. This is what your host likes to call the beige illusion. It is the comforting but rather wacky assumption that Latino is a skin tone. A crayon in the proverbial 64 pack, if you will. A crayon whose slot sits somewhere between toasted almond and latte with intentions. But here is the problem. Latino is not a race. It is not a color. It's not even a Pantone swatch. And it's not a sunscreen rating. It is a cultural and linguistic inheritance tied to the Iberian Peninsula. A peninsula which, the last time we checked, remains stubbornly attached to Europe. And yet, in our American discourse, we tend to speak as if 600 million people across 2 continents and a scattering of islands share not only a common language, but a common melanin concentration. That is not an exercise in sociology, it is an exercise in paint mixing. And tonight, in the name of intellectual and demographic rigor, we are scraping that paint off of the damn wall. Episode 1, the census form that broke everyone's brain. Let's begin with a document that is so boring it could tranquilize a meth-addicted rhinoceros, namely, the United States Census. On the census form, you are asked 2 separate questions. The first question is this: what is your race? You have one of 6 options. Number 1, white. Number 2, black or African American. Number 3, Asian. Number 4, Native American. Number 5, Pacific Islander. Number 6, other. Then you are asked a completely separate question. Are you of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? Now let's all pause for a moment and take a deep cleansing breath. If Latino were in fact a race, the form would not need 2 questions. The federal government, an institution not widely renowned for subtle metaphysical distinctions, has nonetheless managed to grasp a concept that cable news panels routinely fumble. Hispanic is an ethnicity. White is a racial category, and these are not mutually exclusive concepts. You can be white and Hispanic. You can be black and Hispanic. You can be Asian and Hispanic. You can be indigenous and Hispanic. You can even be confused and Hispanic, which apparently is one of our national pastimes. And yet, every election cycle, and more often still, we hear breathless commentary about something called the Latino vote, as though we are discussing a hive mind that convenes quarterly in order to issue color updates. If your whole mental model collapses when someone checks both white and Latino, that's not them being contradictory, that is you being a dumbass. Episode 2, Iberia is still in Europe, last time we checked. Now let's take a moment to review a bit of 4th grade geography, shall we? Spain is in Europe. Portugal is also in Europe. They have each been in Europe for quite some time, as long as anybody can remember. In fact, they are not honorary Europeans. They are not provisional Europeans. They are not exchange students from the global south. They are simply Europeans. Spanish is a European language. Portuguese is also a European language. These languages did not bubble up spontaneously from the Amazon rainforest like a fashionable new brand of artisanal kombucha. They came across the Atlantic in wooden boats filled with extremely confident Europeans. And when those Europeans settled in the Americas, they did what humans have done for all of history. They reproduced. Now, did they also mix with indigenous populations? Yes, they did. Did they mix with Africans brought through the slave trade? Also, yes. Did Latin America develop complex, layered, and regionally distinct racial hierarchies of its own? Absolutely yes. But here is the part that seems to short-circuit the internal wiring of the American cerebellum. European settlers in Latin America, wait for it, they had European descendants. I know, it's a lot to take in, but we will get through this together. And those descendants did not evaporate. They did not turn sepia upon exposure to equatorial humidity. They did not wake up one morning and say, "My goodness, I appear to have become non-white due to a verb conjugation." They remained what they were, Spaniards and Portuguese descendants, now speaking Spanish or Portuguese in a different hemisphere. If speaking Spanish makes you non-white, then every sophomore who spends a semester abroad in Madrid should prepare for a fairly dramatic transformation. Duolingo is a powerful thing, but alas, it is not alchemy. Episode 3, Argentina, or How an Italian Restaurant Became a Country. If Americans knew anything, really anything at all about Argentina, half of this confusion would quickly evaporate. Argentina is, demographically speaking, what happens when Europe misplaces its car keys and finds them in South America. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Argentina actively encouraged European immigration. Millions of emigres duly arrived, especially Italians and Spaniards. Entire shiploads of Europeans disembarked in Buenos Aires and decided, yes, I think this will do quite nicely. Today, a very substantial majority of Argentines have predominantly European ancestry. Take a walk through Buenos Aires and you will see architecture that looks suspiciously Parisian. Step into a cafe and you will hear an accent that sounds like Italian and Spanish had a very charismatic love child. In fact, linguists have long noted that Rio Platense Spanish, the dialect around Buenos Aires, carries distinctly Italian intonation patterns because so many immigrants came from Naples and Genoa, which means, accordingly, that there are millions of people in Argentina who look Southern European, eat like Southern Europeans, gesture like Southern Europeans, descend from Southern Europeans. But because they speak Spanish in the Western Hemisphere, an American HR department will sometimes look at them and confidently declare, "Ah, yes, a person of color." If your diversity training collapses at the sight of a suspiciously non-melanated Argentine with a name like Federico Rossi, that is not Federico's fault. It is geography's fault, and history's fault, and indeed your fault for not giving a shit about geography or history. Episode 4, the German town with better Wi-Fi than you. Now let's talk about the Germans, because there are a lot of those. Southern Brazil alone has many millions of citizens of German descent. Entire towns, places like Blumenau, Joinville, Novo Hamburgo, and others, were founded by German settlers in the 19th century during those heady halcyon days after the close of the Franco-Prussian War, when the Germans declared, now that there is actually a nation-state called Germany for the first time ever, it is time for us to establish our own colonial empire so we can start feeling a bit less inferior to the British and the French and the Spaniards. In Chile, there are well-documented waves of German immigration beginning even before German unification all the way back to the 1850s, which means it would be more strictly correct to call it Prussian immigration and Bavarian immigration and Saxon immigration, but the host digresses. The point being, you had lots of ethnically German emigres who established lots of German schools, German churches, German newspapers, and all manner of other German institutions. To this day, there are Chileans with surnames like Schneider, Muller, and Schrader who speak flawless Chilean Spanish and can also make a hell of a good strudel. They are not cosplay Europeans. They are the descendants of Europeans, and they grew up speaking Spanish. And when one of them lands at LAX, sunburned from Santiago, passport in hand, and someone mentally files him under the heading of brown-skinned minority, there is a bit of a metaphysical glitch in the American Matrix. It is possible, stay with me here, for a man named Hans to order a plate of empanadas. It is possible for a woman named Ingrid to speak rapid-fire Caribbean Spanish. It is even possible for someone to be both Lutheran and Latino without the universe imploding. Language is not a pigment. Accent is not a melanin supplement. And Duolingo does not perform race reassignment surgeries. Episode 5, The Confederates Who Wouldn't Go Quietly. And now, because history has a sense of humor far darker even than my own, we arrive at the Confederates. After the American Civil War, thousands of former Confederates left the United States rather than living under Reconstruction. Many of them settled in Brazil, particularly in Sao Paulo state. There is still a town called Americana, founded by these very same emigres. Their descendants, sometimes called Confederados even today, still hold cultural festivals. They still trace their lineage back to the American South. In fact, if you want to go to a place where the descendants of Confederate soldiers still proudly wave the stars and bars and unashamedly celebrate the history and culture of the antebellum American South, but you won't find it anywhere in the former Confederacy, but you will find it if you go to Brazil. And if that's not the single most ironic thing in this whole monologue, I don't know what the hell is. Now, just try to imagine explaining that to a descendant of a Confederate colonel, a guy who's now 6 generations deep in Brazil speaking Portuguese, farming his soybeans, that he is not white because he is Latino. I myself would pay a not inconsiderable sum of money to watch that conversation take place, and I suspect I am probably not alone in that inclination. History is a messy thing. Identity has many layers. Sometimes those layers are not as conveniently adjacent to one another as our broad-based, low-information assumptions would prefer that they be. And the Americas were not settled by a monochrome committee. From Spanish aristocrats in Lima to Basque ranchers in Uruguay, from Italian dockworkers in Buenos Aires to German settlers in Chile and Brazil, the Western Hemisphere is a kaleidoscope of European diasporas layered atop indigenous civilizations and African legacies. The result is not a single shade. It is a spectrum, and pretending otherwise may be emotionally convenient, but it is intellectually unserious. And on this program, we do not traffic in intellectual unseriousness. That, after all, is what Twitter is for. Episode 6, Cuba and the racial hierarchy Americans forgot. Let us now don our life vest and sail 90 miles south of Florida for a headlong collision with that cruel mistress named reality. For centuries, many centuries in fact, Cuba operated under a very clear and unambiguous racial hierarchy. A ruling elite class descended from white Europeans, a large population of enslaved Africans and their descendants, and a complex, multifaceted caste structure in between. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't theoretical, it was plantation economics. By the late colonial period, Cuba had one of the largest enslaved African populations in the Americas, which is a fun thing to mention to your woke leftist friend the next time he assures you that chattel slavery was some sort of uniquely American enterprise. At the same time, Cuba also had a powerful white landowning class of Spanish descent that ran the island's politics and its economy. Fast forward to the 20th century, pre-revolutionary Cuba had prominent white political families, white industrial elites, white professionals, white everything. After the revolution, a significant number of those white Cubans fled the island, mainly to Florida, which is how you end up with a political reality in Miami, where some of the most hawkish anti-communist voices in America are Latino voices, and they are white and Spanish-speaking. The idea that Latino equals non-white collapses instantaneously the moment you look at Cuba's history for more than about 12 seconds. In fact, Cuba alone should have ended this confusion, but nevertheless, here we are. Episode 7, Race versus Ethnicity, the category error that ate cable news. Now we must perform a brief public service announcement. Race and ethnicity are not synonyms. Race in modern American discourse is largely about physical ancestry markers, skin tone, facial features, etc. Ethnicity refers to one's cultural identity, language, heritage, traditions, historical origins. Latino is an ethnicity. It describes people who are connected to Latin American cultures. It does not describe a skin color. You can be any number of things: white and Latino, black and Latino, indigenous and Latino, mixed and Latino. You can even be East Asian and Latino, a fact to which around 200,000 Japanese Peruvians will readily attest. If this feels shocking, that's because American racial thinking tends to operate on a simplified binary model inherited from its own history. The United States had a very particular racial structure that was shaped largely by slavery and segregation. And when you're operating in a simplistically ethnocentric headspace, as Americans have a regrettable tendency to do, it is tempting to project that template onto the entire Western Hemisphere. But the Western Hemisphere did not sign up for America's PowerPoint presentation. Latin America developed mostly under Iberian colonial systems with different racial classifications, different social hierarchies, and different intermarriage patterns. Trying to compress all of those factors into the color brown is not progressive, it's just lazy. It's the intellectual equivalent of labeling every European French, which, needless to say, wouldn't go over very well with the Germans. Episode 8, the mythical creature known as the Latino vote. And now we arrive at one of my favorite American cultural hallucinations, the Latino vote. Every election cycle, pundits gather around a glowing map and whisper reverently about it, saying things like, "The Latino vote is shifting. The Latino vote is energized. The Latino vote is disappointed." As though they're discussing a singular hive mind organism that meets annually in Phoenix to decide what its current feelings are. There are Mexican Americans in Texas whose families have been in North America since before Texas was even Texas. There are Cuban Americans in Florida whose worldview was shaped largely by Cold War exile politics. There are Venezuelan immigrants in Doral who have strong opinions about socialism and not the academic kind. There are Puerto Ricans in New York whose political calculus differs wildly from Salvadorans in Los Angeles. Some are conservative Catholics. Some are secular progressives. Some are evangelical Protestants. Some are business owners. Some are union members. And a great many of them look very different from one another. The assumption that a pale Argentine banker, a dark-skinned Dominican teacher, and a third-generation Mexican-American oil field worker will move in electoral lockstep because they share a linguistic heritage is ambitious at best and a shockingly offensive stereotype at worst. Americans would never speak about something called the European vote. Why? Because we understand that Swedes, Greeks, and Poles are not the same thing. But say Latino, and suddenly nuance packs its bags and quietly egresses the building. Episode 9, How America Exported Its Racial Framework. Here is where things get interesting. The United States developed a very particular racial architecture shaped by British colonial law and the one-drop rule and various segregation statutes and a black-white binary that dominated public life in certain parts of the country for centuries. That framework makes sense, historically, inside of the American story. The problem begins when Americans assume it is the default operating system for the entire hemisphere, for it is not. Spanish and Portuguese colonial societies developed very elaborate, sometimes nigh impenetrable caste systems. Peninsulares, criollos, mestizos, mulattoes, messy, hierarchical, inconsistent, but very starkly different from the American binary. Intermarriage was more common. Racial categories were often more fluid. Social status could often hinge on class, language, and proximity to power as much as on skin tone. When modern Americans try to interpret Latin America using strictly American racial categories, it's like trying to run European voltage through an American appliance. There will be sparks. Sometimes there will be smoke. And occasionally, a graduate thesis that probably ought not to have been published. The irony is a rather delicious one. In attempting to be culturally sensitive, Americans sometimes flatten entire societies into caricature. We accuse others of oversimplifying race, and then we oversimplify race internationally. That is not enlightenment. That is provincialism with slightly better branding. Episode 10, Why This Misunderstanding Actually Matters. Now, someone in the chat is probably going to say, come on, Cap, who really cares? Isn't this just all semantics? To which the host retorts, no, it is not. It matters for at least 3 reasons. First, policy. If lawmakers and institutions operate under crude assumptions about identity, they craft crude policy. You cannot build intelligent outreach, education, or immigration policy when such policy predicates itself on demographic fantasy. Second, political analysis. If pundits assume uniformity where none exists, they will be repeatedly shocked by election results and then blame the voters for not behaving properly. Third, and this one is personal, is dignity. People deserve to be understood as they are, not as a projection of someone else's cultural template. Telling a white Chilean of German descent that he is non-white because he speaks Spanish is not progressive solidarity. It is a misunderstanding wearing a name tag. And misunderstandings, when repeated often enough, harden into dogma. Dogma then becomes policy. Policy becomes reality. And suddenly, a category error has real consequences. If you're serious about diversity, you must first be serious about accuracy. Otherwise, you're just rearranging stereotypes and calling it moral progress. Epilogue, Curmudgeon's Field Guide for a Perplexed Republic. So here, dear viewer, is the TLDR version of your field guide. If someone speaks Spanish, do not assume their skin tone. Do not assume their ancestry. Do not assume their politics. Do not assume they vote as part of a synchronized hive organism. Ask questions. Learn history. Resist the urge to compress 500 years of hemispheric complexity into a drop-down menu. The Americas are vast. They are layered. They are complicated. And that complexity is not a bug. It is the story. If you wish to reduce it to a single earth tone for the sake of rhetorical convenience, you are not correcting prejudice. You are merely inventing a new prejudice. On this program, we believe in facts. We believe in history. We believe in irritating everyone equally. And above all, we believe that hemispheres do not come with Cliff's Notes. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, very much indeed for your kind attention. And I now convey you into the custody of my distinguished colleague, your illustrious co-host, the one and only, your friend and mine, Mr. Caucasian Sasquatch.